Picture this. It's February 14, 1887, and you're standing outside your Paris office reading the morning newspaper. You've just won the contract to build the centerpiece of the World's Fair, the tallest structure humanity has ever attempted. You should be celebrating. Instead, you're reading your own professional obituation. The headline screams across the front page. 300 of France's most respected artists, writers, and intellectuals have signed a petition calling your project a metallic monstrosity, a grotesque disaster, a useless and monstrous tower that will disfigure Paris forever. Guy de Maupassant, one of France's most celebrated novelists, has called it an abomination. Charles Garnier, the architect who designed the Paris Opera House, one of the most beautiful buildings in Europe, says your tower will make Paris ugly and ordinary. These aren't random critics. These are the people who define French culture, and they want your project dead. But here's the thing nobody saw coming. Within 30 years, that same hideous tower would become the most recognizable structure on planet Earth. Maupassant himself, the guy who called it an abomination, would end up eating lunch inside the tower restaurant almost every day. And when asked why, he'd say something incredible. It's the only place in Paris where I don't have to see the damned thing. The man at the center of this storm was Gustave Eiffel. And his story is about something bigger than just building a tower. It's about what happens when engineering genius collides with artistic prejudice, when industrial innovation threatens cultural tradition, and when one person's vision becomes everyone else's worst nightmare until suddenly it doesn't. This is the story of how a brilliant engineer revolutionized construction, survived industrial espionage, faced public humiliation, got convicted in a massive corruption scandal, and still managed to create something so beautiful that his enemies became pilgrims. And the wildest part? He almost didn't build the tower at all. How did an engineer with German ancestry become the man who built France's most iconic symbol? And how did the structure that nearly destroyed his career end up saving his legacy? Before we dive deeper into Eiffel's story, if you're into tales about the brilliant engineers and controversial figures who built the modern world, hit that subscribe button. This channel is all about the people who changed everything, for better or worse. And let me know in the comments if you'd ever heard about the artist's petition before today, because this controversy was massive. Now, to understand what Eiffel was up against, you need to understand what the industrial world looked like in the 1880s. Think of late 19th century Europe as a brutal startup race, but instead of apps, they were building factories that could explode at any moment, and instead of venture capital, they had empires competing to prove which country could build bigger, taller, and more dangerous. France was in a weird position. Britain was that friend who already owned all the factories and didn't want anyone else joining the club. They'd industrialized first, which meant they had a massive head start. The Germans were catching up fast, investing heavily in chemical engineering and steel production. And France? France was stuck in the middle, trying to prove they could compete, while their cultural elite kept insisting that art and beauty mattered more than industrial power. This wasn't just about national pride. The Franco-Prussian War had ended in 1871, with France getting absolutely humiliated by Germany. They'd lost territory, paid massive war reparations, and watched Prussian troops march through Paris. For French engineers, building something spectacular wasn't just about showing off technical skill. It was about proving France still mattered on the world stage. The 1889 Universal Exhibition was supposed to be France's comeback moment. Every country would send their best industrial achievements, their finest art, their most innovative technology. It was basically like hosting the Olympics and the World's Fair simultaneously, with the entire world watching to see if you could pull it off. The French government wanted something impossible for the centerpiece, a 1,000-foot iron tower right in the heart of Paris. To give you perspective, the The tallest structure in the world at that time was the Washington Monument at 555 feet. They wanted to nearly double that, in the center of one of the world's most beautiful cities, using iron, which most architects considered an ugly industrial material that belonged in factories, not in public view. The competition to design this tower attracted some of the most ambitious engineers in Europe, but most proposals looked like industrial nightmares, exactly what the artists feared. Giant brick towers, massive stone pyramids. One guy suggested an enormous granite lighthouse. They all shared one problem. They'd be so heavy, they'd probably sink into the Paris soil before construction even finished. Eiffel's proposal was different. His tower would be light, almost impossibly light. Instead of fighting against the wind, his design would let the wind pass through. The iron lattice structure, that crisscrossed pattern you can see today, would be like a huge net that air could flow through rather than push against. It was brilliant engineering, but to artists and architects it looked like industrial scaffolding that someone forgot to cover up. And here's what made the whole situation even more tense. Eiffel wasn't even born with a French name. His grandfather was German, born in the Eifel region near the German-French border, with the family name Bonnickhausen. They'd changed it to Eiffel when they moved to France. So now you had a guy with German roots during a period of intense anti-German sentiment, proposing to build France's most prominent national symbol out of industrial iron. The optics were terrible, but Eiffel had one massive advantage. He'd already proven he could do impossible things with iron. Alexandre Gustave Eiffel was born in Dijon, France, on December 15, 1832. His family wasn't wealthy, but they weren't poor either. They owned a coal business, which meant young Gustave grew up around industrial materials and the men who worked with them. While other middle-class kids were reading poetry, he was watching workers handle iron and calculate weights. His mother ran the business, which was unusual for the time. She was tough, practical, and excellent with numbers. She taught Gustave that success meant paying attention to details and not being afraid to do things differently than everyone else. That lesson would define his entire career. Gustave wasn't a child prodigy. He was good at math and science, but not exceptional. What made him different was his obsession with understanding how things worked. He'd take apart machines to see their mechanisms, then spend hours figuring out how to make them better. His family thought he'd take over the coal business. Gustave had other plans. He applied to École Polytechnique, which was basically the MIT of France at the time, the most prestigious engineering school in the country. He didn't get in. His test scores were good, but not good enough. So he went to École Centrale des Arts et Manufactures instead, which was considered the second-tier option, more focused on practical industrial applications than theoretical research. Here's the thing, though, not getting into the top school might have been the best thing that ever happened to him. École Polytechnique trained engineers to design things and let other people build them. École Centrale trained engineers who got their hands dirty, who understood construction from the ground up. Eiffel learned metallurgy, structural calculations, and most importantly, how to actually manage workers on construction sites. He graduated in 1855 with decent grades and absolutely no job prospects. The economy was rough, and civil engineering positions were hard to find. He spent months applying to companies and getting rejected. Finally, through a family connection, he landed a position with Charles Neveu, a railway engineer working on bridge construction. This is where Eiffel's real education began. Bridge building in the 1850s was incredibly dangerous work. You're spanning rivers, sometimes hundreds of feet above the water, using materials that can fail catastrophically. Iron was still relatively new as a construction material. Engineers were figuring out its properties through trial and error, and sometimes the errors killed people. Eiffel's first major project was the railway bridge at Bordeaux over the Garonne River. The problem was that the riverbed was too soft for traditional foundation techniques. Conventional wisdom said you couldn't build there. But Eiffel suggested using compressed air caissons, basically giant chambers that you sink into the riverbed and pressurize, so water can't get in. Workers would go down into these pressurized boxes and excavate the foundation while staying dry. It was dangerous work. Workers sometimes got the bends, which is what happens when you depressurize too quickly after breathing compressed air. Nitrogen bubbles form in your blood, causing excruciating pain and sometimes death. But it worked. The bridge got built, and Eiffel learned a crucial lesson. Sometimes the most innovative solution is also the most terrifying. That Bordeaux bridge made his reputation. Suddenly, other engineers wanted to work with this guy who could solve supposedly impossible problems. By 1866, he'd founded his own company, Eiffel Acier, with headquarters in Levallois-Perret, just outside Paris. The company specialized in metal structures, particularly bridges. Eiffel didn't just design them. He developed completely new construction methods. One innovation was prefabrication, building components in the factory and then assembling them on site. This was revolutionary for remote locations where you couldn't build a factory nearby. You'd manufacture everything in Paris, ship the pieces, and put them together like an enormous metal puzzle. He built bridges everywhere: France, Spain, Portugal, Hungary, Romania, colonies in South America, and Asia. Each bridge pushed iron construction further. The Maria Pia Bridge in Portugal, completed in 1877, featured an arched span that seemed to defy physics. It looked too light, too delicate. Engineers from other countries studied his calculations, trying to figure out how it didn't collapse. But there was a darker side to his success that most people didn't know about yet. And when it finally came out, it would nearly destroy him. By the 1880s, Eiffel wasn't just building bridges. He was building an empire. His company employed hundreds of workers, operated multiple factories, and had contracts spanning 3 continents. He was getting wealthy, really wealthy, and in industrial France, wealth meant power. But Eiffel's motivation wasn't primarily money. What drove him was the engineering challenge. Every project had to be more ambitious, more technically difficult than the last. He became obsessed with pushing iron to its absolute limits. The Garabet Viaduct, completed in 1884, was his masterpiece before the tower. It spanned a valley in southern France with an arch spanning over 500 feet. The railway crossed more than 400 feet above the river below. When it opened, it was the highest bridge in the world. More importantly, it proved that Eiffel could build large-scale structures that looked impossibly delicate, but were actually incredibly strong. Here's what made Eiffel different from other engineers of his time. He didn't just rely on calculations, he tested everything. His factory had equipment for stress testing iron beams, for measuring how metal responded to temperature changes, for simulating wind pressure. Other engineers thought this was excessive. Eiffel thought it was the minimum requirement for not killing people. His company developed proprietary techniques for everything. How to rivet iron beams together to create joints stronger than the beams themselves. How to calculate wind loads on large structures. How to coat iron to prevent rust without adding significant weight. These innovations made his bridges lighter, stronger, and cheaper to build than his competitors. But business success brought new problems. Rivals accused him of stealing their designs. Labor unions complained about working conditions in his factories. Journalists questioned his connections to government officials who kept awarding him contracts. Some of these criticisms were valid. Others were just envy. The biggest controversy came with the Pest Railway Bridge in Hungary, completed in 1876. Engineers raised safety concerns about the design. Some claimed Eiffel had cut corners to save money. An official investigation found the bridge was safe, but the scandal damaged his reputation in engineering circles. For years afterward, rival engineers would whisper that Eiffel was more concerned with profits than safety. Then came an opportunity that would change everything: the Statue of Liberty's internal structure. Most people think of the Statue of Liberty as a sculpture, which it is, but the real engineering challenge was creating a skeleton that could support all that copper sheeting while being flexible enough to sway in the wind without cracking. Auguste Bartholdi, the sculptor, needed an engineer who could make the impossible possible. Eiffel designed an iron framework that was basically a tower within the statue. The copper skin would hang from this internal structure, but not rigidly. He created a system of flexible connections that allowed the skin to move slightly independent of the skeleton. This way, wind pressure wouldn't stress the connections to the breaking point. It was brilliant engineering, solving a problem most people didn't even realize existed. The Statue of Liberty work, completed in 1886, brought Eiffel international recognition. American engineers praised his innovative approach. French officials saw it as proof that French engineering could compete with anyone. And most importantly, it demonstrated Eiffel's ability to build something tall, really tall, and make it stable. That same year, the French government announced the competition for the 1889 Universal Exhibition centerpiece. The winner would have their design become the most prominent structure in Paris, visible from across the city. More importantly, the winner would get a massive construction contract that would make them either very rich or very bankrupt. Eiffel decided he wanted this contract more than anything he'd ever attempted. But he had a secret. The tower design wasn't actually his idea. Two of his senior engineers, Maurice Koechlin and Émile Nouguier, had developed the basic concept years earlier. They'd done all the mathematical calculations, figured out the curve that would provide maximum stability with minimum weight. Koechlin was a mathematical genius who could calculate stress loads in his head. Nouguier was a structural specialist who understood how iron behaved under extreme conditions. Eiffel looked at their design and immediately saw its potential, but he also saw its problem. It looked too industrial, too much like naked scaffolding. He brought in Stephen Sovestre, an architect, to add decorative elements, arches at the base, platforms with ornamental railings, details that would make the tower look more like architecture and less like construction equipment. Then Eiffel did something clever. He bought the patent rights from Koechlin and Nouguier, made himself the project's sole official designer, and presented the tower as his personal vision. This wasn't unusual for the time. Company owners routinely took credit for their employees' work. But it would later fuel accusations that Eiffel was more businessman than engineer. When he submitted his proposal, he emphasized something crucial. The tower would be a laboratory for scientific experiments. It would have research facilities for meteorology, wireless telegraphy, and aeronautics. This wasn't just a decoration, it was infrastructure. The scientific angle convinced many politicians who might otherwise have opposed the project. But convincing the government was one thing. Convincing Paris's cultural elite was about to prove impossible. The moment Eiffel's tower design won the competition, France's artistic establishment lost their minds. And I mean this literally. They organized, petitioned, and essentially declared cultural warfare against an engineer who just wanted to build something ambitious. The protest of 300 wasn't some casual complaint. It was a carefully orchestrated PR campaign designed to destroy the project before construction even began. The petition read like a funeral announcement for Paris itself. We, writers, painters, sculptors, architects, passionate lovers of the beauty of Paris, protest with all our strength against the erection, in the heart of our capital, of the useless and monstrous Eiffel Tower. Charles Garnier, who designed one of Paris's most celebrated buildings, argued that iron was fundamentally unsuitable for artistic expression. Alexandre Dumas Fils, the playwright, called the tower an aberration. Charles Gounod, the composer, claimed the tower would somehow destroy Paris's musical harmony, which makes zero sense but sounded profound to newspaper readers. But the most obsessive critic was Guy de Maupassant, This guy turned tower hatred into performance art. He wrote scathing articles. He made public speeches. He organized protest meetings. According to his own accounts, he experienced physical revulsion when looking at the tower's construction. He claimed it gave him nightmares. Here's what made the controversy so intense. It wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about what Paris represented. For centuries, Paris had been the cultural capital of Europe. It was where artists came to create, where intellectual movements were born, where beauty was defined. The city's architecture reflected this. Classical buildings, elegant proportions, stone and marble, and careful symmetry. Eiffel's tower represented everything these artists feared. Industrial materials instead of traditional construction. Mathematical precision instead of artistic inspiration. Engineering innovation, rather than respect for classical principles. To them, the tower wasn't just ugly. It symbolized the replacement of art with industry, culture with commerce, beauty with function. The artists had public opinion on their side, at least initially. Newspapers ran caricatures showing the tower as a grotesque monster devouring Paris. Political cartoons depicted Eiffel as the industrial vandal destroying French heritage. Some editorials suggested the tower was part of a German plot to humiliate France with an ugly monument. There were even death threats. Anonymous letters promised to assassinate Eiffel if construction continued. Whether these were serious or theatrical, nobody knew, but they created real fear. Eiffel had to vary his routes to the construction site. He hired security personnel to screen visitors to his office. The government wavered. Minister Edouard Lockroy supported the project, but he faced enormous political pressure to cancel it. Some officials suggested compromising, build a smaller tower, or build it somewhere outside Paris where it wouldn't dominate the skyline. Eiffel refused. It was the full design or nothing. Construction began in January 1887 despite the protests. The first workers arrived at the Champ de Mars, a large open space that had been a military training ground. Almost immediately, things started going wrong. The foundation work was brutally difficult. You're trying to anchor a 1,000-foot tower in soil that wasn't particularly stable. Each of the 4 legs needed massive concrete foundations that had to be perfectly level with each other. Even a slight difference in height would create enormous stress problems as the tower grew taller. The margin of error was basically zero. But the real problems were the workers themselves. Iron workers were tough guys, used to dangerous conditions. But this project was different. You're assembling a lattice structure that gets narrower as it rises. You're working at heights nobody had ever attempted before. There's no safety net, because nobody had invented effective safety nets yet. Workers started quitting almost immediately. The heights terrified them. Eiffel had to constantly recruit replacements, offering premium wages to convince men to risk their lives. He also did something innovative. He installed primitive safety equipment. Wooden platforms that could be moved upward as construction progressed. Basic harnesses that could catch a falling worker. It wasn't much by modern standards, but for the 1880s, it was revolutionary. The construction site became a spectacle. Crowds gathered daily to watch workers scramble around the growing iron skeleton hundreds of feet in the air. Some people came to admire the engineering. Others came hoping to witness a disaster. Newspapers sent reporters to document every setback, every delay, every problem. Winter 1887 brought the first major crisis. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Iron rivets had to be heated red hot and then hammered into place while they were still soft. In freezing weather, they cooled too quickly. Workers couldn't handle the hot rivets without burning their hands even through thick gloves. Tools became painful to hold in the cold. Construction slowed to a crawl. The project fell behind schedule. Critics celebrated, claiming this proved the tower was technically impossible. Eiffel pushed his workers harder, offering bonuses for meeting deadlines. Some workers literally worked until they collapsed from exhaustion. Labor unions began organizing protests about the working conditions. There were also sabotage attempts. Materials would go missing. Tools would be damaged. In one incident, someone cut through support cables overnight, causing a partial collapse of scaffolding. Nobody was hurt, but it could have killed workers if it had happened during the day. Was it rival engineers? Disgruntled workers? Artistic terrorists? Nobody ever found out, and that's when Eiffel realized everything was going to get much, much worse. By summer 1888, the tower had reached 300 feet, about as high as a 30-story building. You could see it from across Paris, a half-finished iron skeleton that looked even more industrial and unfinished than the completed design would suggest. Every day it grew taller, and every day the protests grew louder. But something unexpected was happening. While artists and intellectuals continued their attacks, ordinary Parisians were becoming fascinated. The construction site drew thousands of visitors daily. People wanted to see this impossible thing being built in real time. Vendors set up around the Champ de Mars selling food and souvenirs. The tower was becoming a tourist attraction before it was even finished. The engineering challenges were becoming more extreme with altitude. At ground level, you're using steam-powered cranes to lift iron beams. But as the tower grows, you can't rely on ground-based equipment. Eiffel's team had to develop mobile cranes that could be lifted to higher levels and then used to lift the next section of the tower. It was like building a ladder by standing on the ladder while building it. The precision required was extraordinary. Each iron piece had been manufactured in Eiffel's factory in Levallois-Perret to within 1 millimeter of tolerance. When pieces arrived at the construction site, they had to fit together perfectly, despite the complexity of the three-dimensional structure. There are 18,000 individual iron pieces in the tower, connected by 2.5 million rivets. Every single connection had to be exact. The rivet installation process was like a dangerous ballet. One worker, the heater, would heat iron rivets in a portable forge until they glowed red hot. Another worker, the catcher, would use tongs to catch the thrown rivet. A third worker, the holder, would insert the rivet into the pre-drilled hole and hold it in place. Finally, the riveter would hammer the softened metal into a permanent connection. This four-person team had to work in perfect coordination while standing on narrow platforms hundreds of feet in the air with wind blowing constantly. Jean Compagnon, the master riveter, led the most skilled team. These guys were the elite, the ones who handled the most difficult high-altitude joints. They developed a rhythm, hammering with precise timing so the rivets would set correctly. The sound echoed across Paris, a constant metallic percussion that became the tower's construction soundtrack. The workers developed superstitions. Some refused to work on Fridays, claiming it was unlucky. Others insisted on specific sequences, believing that starting from the wrong corner would cause problems. Eiffel tolerated this, understanding that when you're asking men to risk death daily, you let them have their rituals. Remarkably, there was only one construction fatality during the entire project. A worker named Dusardin fell during the installation of the elevators, but this happened outside regular working hours when he wasn't officially on duty. For a project involving hundreds of workers at extreme heights over 26 months, one death was almost miraculous. Industrial projects of that era typically killed dozens of workers. Eiffel's safety innovations made the difference. The movable wooden platforms caught several falling workers who would otherwise have plummeted to their deaths. The basic harnesses, primitive as they were, prevented numerous fatal falls. More importantly, Eiffel enforced strict rules about worker intoxication and horseplay at heights. Anyone caught drunk on the job was immediately fired. It sounds obvious now, but for 1880s construction sites, it was revolutionary. By December 1888, the tower was approaching 600 feet. The iron lattice was starting to look less like scaffolding and more like intentional architecture. The curved shape, that elegant sweep inward as it rose, was becoming visible. some critics started quietly and reluctantly to admit that maybe, possibly, it wasn't quite as hideous as they'd initially thought. But the artists weren't backing down. If anything, the tower's growing beauty made them angrier. It was supposed to fail, to vindicate their predictions of ugliness. Instead, it was becoming impressive, even striking against the Paris skyline. Guy de Maupassant intensified his attacks, writing increasingly apocalyptic predictions about the tower's destructive impact on French culture. The elevator installation presented yet another engineering nightmare. You can't use conventional elevators for a structure with a curved, slanted shape. Eiffel contracted with multiple companies to develop custom systems. The elevators for the lower sections used hydraulic pistons that pushed cars up at an angle following the tower's curve. The elevator to the top section used a different mechanism entirely. These were the most advanced elevators in the world, installed in the most challenging conditions imaginable. The first platform opened to visitors in May 1888, while construction continued on the upper sections. People could now climb or take the elevator partway up the tower and look out over Paris from a height most had never experienced. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of visitors paid the admission fee. The project, which had been financially risky, was suddenly profitable. Eiffel had made a clever deal with the government. He'd finance much of the construction himself in exchange for keeping ticket revenues for 20 years. Critics had mocked this, assuming the tower would be a financial disaster. Now it looked like Eiffel might become even wealthier from his useless monstrosity. The final assembly of the top section took place in March 1889. Workers installed a flagpole at the summit, making the tower's total height 1,083 feet. A team led by Eiffel himself climbed to the top to place the French flag. The tower was complete. The tallest structure humanity had ever built. It would hold that record for 41 years until the Chrysler Building in New York. The inauguration ceremony happened on March 31st, 1889. Eiffel led a group of officials, including representatives from the government and the exhibition organizers, up the tower's 1,710 steps. The elevators weren't quite finished yet. At the top, Eiffel gave a speech about French engineering prowess and lit the tower's gas lighting system. Then he did something symbolic. He attached a bronze plaque at the summit, listing the names of 72 French scientists, engineers, and mathematicians. His way of saying the tower represented not just his achievement, but French scientific and technical tradition. Notably, all 72 names were men. Women engineers existed at this time, but weren't considered worthy of recognition. The Universal Exhibition opened on May 6, 1889, and suddenly everything changed in ways nobody had anticipated. The 1889 Universal Exhibition was massive. Nearly 32 million people visited during the 6 months it ran. The exhibition showcased everything from Thomas Edison's phonograph to exotic cultural displays from French colonies. But the undisputed star was Eiffel's Tower. Nearly 2 million people visited the tower during the exhibition. They lined up for hours to take the elevators to viewing platforms where they could see Paris spread out below them in a way nobody had ever experienced before. The entrance fees generated enormous revenue, paying off construction debts and making Eiffel personally wealthy. The cultural tide was turning. Critics who'd predicted universal hatred found themselves contradicted by massive popular enthusiasm. Parisians loved the tower. Tourists were obsessed with it. It became the symbol of the exhibition, the thing everyone wanted to see and photograph. Even some of the original protesters were quietly changing their positions. Artists who'd signed the Protest of 300 now claimed they'd never been that opposed, or that their concerns had been misrepresented. A few publicly recanted, admitting the tower was actually quite beautiful, but not Guy de Maupassant. That guy never surrendered. The famous story about Maupassant eating lunch in the Tower restaurant every day is documented by multiple witnesses. When asked why he dined there so regularly, He supposedly said it was the only place in Paris where he didn't have to look at the hideous iron cage. But here's the thing. Whether this story is true or exaggerated, it reveals something important. Even the tower's harshest critic couldn't stay away from it. The tower was doing something nobody had quite anticipated. It was making iron beautiful. Throughout the 19th century, iron had been considered purely functional. It belonged in factories and warehouses, places where appearance didn't matter. Architects might use iron for internal structure, but they'd always hide it behind stone facades. Eiffel's tower forced everyone to look at exposed iron as architecture. The lattice pattern created geometric beauty. The curve of the structure gave it organic elegance, despite being made from industrial materials. Sunlight created shadow patterns that changed throughout the day. At night, gas lighting made it glow against the dark sky like a beacon. The tower became a symbol of modernity itself. It represented the future. The idea that industrial engineering could create new forms of beauty that classical rules didn't account for. This was hugely controversial in art circles, but it was also undeniable. The tower looked like nothing else that had ever existed, and it was magnificent. International visitors were particularly enthusiastic. The tower demonstrated French engineering superiority in a very visible way. British engineers grudgingly admitted it was an impressive achievement. German engineers studied the construction techniques, trying to understand how Eiffel had managed the precision assembly at that scale. American industrialists saw it as proof that Europe could still innovate despite America's growing industrial power. Scientists immediately recognized the tower's research potential. Meteorologists installed weather monitoring equipment. Physiologists studied the effects of altitude on human bodies. Later, wireless telegraph pioneers would use the tower for radio transmission experiments, which would ultimately save it from demolition. But while Eiffel was celebrating his triumph, clouds were gathering on a completely different front. His involvement in the Panama Canal project was about to explode into the biggest scandal of his career. The Panama Canal was supposed to be France's greatest engineering achievement, linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through Central America. Ferdinand de Lesseps, who'd successfully built the Suez Canal, was leading the project. He promised investors enormous returns. The French public bought stocks enthusiastically, patriotically funding what they believed would be a national triumph. The project was a disaster from the beginning. The engineering challenges were far more difficult than anyone anticipated. Tropical diseases killed thousands of workers. The cost overruns were spectacular. By 1889, the Panama Canal Company was essentially bankrupt, having burned through hundreds of millions of francs. Eiffel's involvement was relatively minor, but financially significant. His company had a contract to design and manufacture lock gates for the canal. The contract was worth millions of francs. But here's where things got murky. There were allegations that Eiffel's company had vastly overcharged for the work, inflating costs to profit from a failing project. In 1892, the Panama Canal Company finally collapsed completely. Tens of thousands of French investors lost their life savings. The scandal became a national crisis. Newspapers demanded accountability. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves from the disaster. Someone had to be blamed, and the search for scapegoats was ruthless. Ferdinand de Lesseps was the obvious target, but prosecutors cast a wider net. They went after anyone who'd profited from the Panama Project, financial intermediaries who'd facilitated bribes, politicians who'd taken payments for favorable votes, engineers who'd submitted inflated invoices. The investigation uncovered a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of French government and business. Eiffel was caught in this net. Prosecutors accused him of overcharging the Panama Canal Company by 8 million francs. They claimed he'd known the company was failing, but had deliberately inflated his bills to extract maximum profit before the collapse. Essentially, they were accusing him of fraud. Just when he thought he'd achieved immortality with his tower, Eiffel was about to face criminal charges that could send him to prison. The Panama scandal trial began in February 1893, and it was an absolute media circus. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the engineer who'd built the Suez Canal and was considered a national hero, sat in the defendant's dock alongside his son, Charles. Gustave Eiffel, the man who'd built Paris's most iconic monument just 4 years earlier, was right there with them. Newspapers covered every moment of the trial. Courtroom sketches showed Eiffel looking grim, occasionally taking notes, responding to prosecutors with technical explanations that sounded like excuses. The man who'd been celebrated as an engineering genius was now portrayed as a greedy businessman who'd stolen from investors. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Eiffel's company had charged 8 million francs for work on the Panama lock gates. Comparable work by other companies would have cost maybe half that amount. The difference represented pure fraud, money stolen from investors who'd trusted in French engineering to build a national project. Eiffel's defense was more complicated. He argued that his company's charges were justified by the unique technical challenges of the Panama project. The lock gates had to be manufactured to unprecedented size and precision, then shipped thousands of miles, and installed in brutal tropical conditions. The work was far more difficult than conventional estimates suggested. His prices reflected real costs, not inflated profiteering. But here's what made the situation truly damaging. Evidence emerged that Eiffel had connections to Baron Jacques de Reynac, a financial intermediary who'd been involved in bribing politicians to support Panama Canal funding. Reynac had died mysteriously, possibly by suicide, just before the scandal broke. The prosecution suggested Eiffel had been part of a corruption network that went far beyond simple overcharging. Eiffel vehemently denied any involvement in bribery. He maintained that his relationship with Reynac was purely professional, that he'd negotiated contracts through proper channels, that he'd delivered exactly what the Panama company had requested. But the court of public opinion had already convicted him. Think about what this meant for his reputation. 5 years earlier, he'd been the engineer who built the world's tallest tower against incredible opposition. Now he was the businessman who'd allegedly stolen from thousands of ordinary French people who'd invested their savings in a national project. The contrast was devastating. The trial revealed uncomfortable truths about how major industrial projects actually worked. The romantic notion of brilliant engineers building magnificent structures for the glory of France collided with the reality of cost overruns, insider deals, inflated invoices, and political favors. Eiffel wasn't just defending himself, he was defending the entire system of how engineering contracts got negotiated and fulfilled. In February 1893, the court reached its verdict. Ferdinand de Lesseps received a 5-year prison sentence, though he was too old and ill to actually serve it. His son Charles got the same sentence, and Gustave Eiffel was convicted of fraud, sentenced to 2 years in prison and fined 20,000 francs. The verdict shocked Eiffel. He genuinely believed the evidence supported his defense. Finding himself convicted as a criminal was a personal and professional catastrophe. His reputation was destroyed. Business contracts dried up immediately. Social circles that had celebrated him now shunned him. For a man who'd spent his entire career building his professional reputation, this was annihilation. But Eiffel had resources. He immediately appealed the conviction. His lawyers argued that the trial had been fundamentally unfair, that political pressure had influenced the verdict, that the prosecution had failed to prove actual fraud versus simply high costs. The appeals process would take time, but Eiffel was determined to clear his name. During this period, his mental state was reportedly fragile. Friends described him as withdrawn, depressed, obsessed with reviewing financial documents trying to find the evidence that would prove his innocence. He'd gone from the highest professional achievement imaginable to criminal conviction in less than 5 years. The psychological whiplash must have been unbearable. The tower, ironically, became his refuge. While his business reputation collapsed, the tower continued drawing enormous crowds. Ticket revenues kept flowing. The structure itself stood as physical proof that he'd built something lasting, something genuinely magnificent, regardless of what courts said about Panama Canal invoices. In July 1893, the appeals court overturned Eiffel's conviction. The appeals judges found that the prosecution had failed to prove intentional fraud. High costs weren't the same thing as criminal overcharging. Eiffel's technical justifications for his pricing were plausible. The conviction couldn't stand. Legally, Eiffel was vindicated. But socially and professionally, the damage was permanent. Once you've been publicly convicted of fraud, even if the conviction gets overturned, the stain never fully disappears. People remember the scandal more than the exoneration. Rivals and critics had all the ammunition they needed to dismiss him as corrupt. His engineering company never fully recovered. Major contracts went to competitors. Government projects avoided him due to political sensitivity. The man who'd built over 100 bridges and the world's tallest tower found himself effectively blacklisted from the industrial work he loved. The psychological toll was severe. Eiffel was 60 years old, wealthy from tower revenues, but professionally marginalized. He'd expected to spend his final decades building ever more ambitious structures. Instead, he was a controversial figure whose technical brilliance was overshadowed by scandal. So what do you do when the career you've built for 4 decades suddenly ends in humiliation? Eiffel did something unexpected. After the Panama scandal, Eiffel basically said, "Forget industrial engineering. I'm becoming a scientist." And here's the weird part. He was actually really good at it. In 1898, Eiffel installed a weather station at the top of his tower. This wasn't just about redemption. The tower's height made it perfect for meteorological research. You could study how temperature, air pressure, and humidity changed with altitude. You could measure wind patterns at heights previously inaccessible. The tower became, quite literally, the world's tallest scientific instrument. But Eiffel's real obsession became aeronautics. Remember, this is the late 1800s. The Wright brothers won't achieve powered flight until 1903. Aviation is still theoretical for most people. But Eiffel became convinced that understanding air resistance was the key to making human flight possible. He started dropping objects from the tower's top platform and timing their falls. Then he'd compare actual fall times with calculated predictions. The differences revealed how air resistance affected different shapes. A sphere fell differently than a cube. A flat plate fell differently than a pointed cone. These experiments sound simple, but they produced crucial data about how air interacts with moving objects. In 1903, the same year the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk, Eiffel built a wind tunnel at the base of his tower. Now imagine what a wind tunnel is. Basically a tube where you blow air at controlled speeds past objects and measure the forces. It's like the expensive specialized tube for studying air resistance. Eiffel's wind tunnel was crude by modern standards, but revolutionary for its time. He could mount different shapes in the tunnel, blow air past them at various speeds, and measure the drag forces with sophisticated instruments. He tested hundreds of shapes, cylinders, spheres, airfoils, flat plates, complex geometric forms. Each test produced data points that helped explain how air resistance worked. The aviation pioneers immediately recognized the value of this research. Louis Blériot, who'd make the first airplane crossing of the English Channel in 1909, consulted with Eiffel about wing shapes. Gabriel Voisin, another early aviation pioneer, used Eiffel's wind tunnel data to design more efficient aircraft. Eiffel's tower, the structure that artists had called useless, was now enabling human flight. In 1909, something important happened that would save the tower itself. The government had only authorized the tower's existence for 20 years. The original plan was to dismantle it after the 1889 exhibition lease expired in 1909. Many people, particularly in artistic circles, still wanted it gone. The artists' protest hadn't disappeared. It had just been temporarily overruled by popular enthusiasm. But the tower had become incredibly valuable for wireless telegraphy. Radio was the emerging technology of the early 20th century, and transmission range depended on antenna height. The tower was the perfect radio antenna, far taller than anything else available. The French military recognized that destroying the tower would be strategically idiotic. There was also an economic argument. The tower generated significant tourist revenue. By 1909, it had become so associated with Paris that removing it would be like removing the Arc de Triomphe. Foreign visitors expected to see it. Postcards featured it. The tower had transformed from controversial innovation to established landmark in just 20 years. So the government extended the tower's existence indefinitely. The structure that was supposed to be temporary became permanent. Eiffel's most controversial achievement was now a protected monument. The artist had lost completely. Throughout this period, Eiffel continued his scientific work with almost manic intensity. He published research papers on air resistance. He gave lectures on aeronautical engineering. He corresponded with aviation pioneers worldwide. For a man who'd been publicly humiliated by the Panama scandal, science offered a form of redemption. He might not be building bridges anymore, but he was advancing human knowledge. In 1912, Eiffel built a larger wind tunnel in Auteuil, on the outskirts of Paris. This facility was far more sophisticated than the tower's original setup. It could generate higher wind speeds and measure more complex forces. Aircraft designers from multiple countries came to test their wing designs in Eiffel's tunnel. The World War broke out in 1914. Eiffel was 82 years old, technically retired, but still actively researching. The tower immediately became militarily important. Its radio capabilities were crucial for communications. Its height made it useful for observing enemy movements. Some historians argue that radio transmissions from the tower helped French intelligence intercept German communications during the crucial First Battle of the Marne. During the war, Eiffel's wind tunnel research became classified military work. Aircraft designers needed better aerodynamic data to create faster, more maneuverable planes. Eiffel's decades of systematic air resistance measurements suddenly became strategic assets. The old engineer who'd been convicted of fraud was now contributing to France's war effort through pure science. Guy de Maupassant, Eiffel's most obsessive critic, had died in 1893, ironically the same year Eiffel's conviction was overturned. He never lived to see the tower become beloved, though according to some accounts, he'd softened his opposition in his final years. Whether this is true or romantic myth, nobody knows for certain. By the time World War I ended, Eiffel was 91 years old and had witnessed his tower's complete transformation from controversial eyesore to national treasure. The war ended in November 1918. Eiffel, now 86 years old, had lived long enough to see his creation become not just accepted, but celebrated. The tower had been absolutely crucial during the war, its radio capabilities helping coordinate military operations and intercept enemy communications. Whatever arguments remained against it had been demolished by its military utility. But for Eiffel personally, the final years were bittersweet. The Panama scandal never fully faded. Historical accounts written during his lifetime still mention the conviction, even if they noted the appeal. His engineering company had essentially ceased major operations. The man who'd built over 100 bridges spent his final years conducting scientific experiments and writing memoirs. He remained intellectually active until the very end. At 90, he was still publishing research papers on air resistance. He maintained correspondence with aviation pioneers, offering advice on wing design and aircraft stability. His wind tunnel in Auteuil continued operating, providing data for French aircraft manufacturers. There's something profoundly lonely about Eiffel's final years. He'd outlived most of his contemporaries. The engineers he'd competed with were dead. The artists who'd opposed him were gone. Even many of his former employees had retired or passed away. He was a living relic from an earlier industrial era, still conducting experiments while the world moved into the age of automobiles and aircraft and modern warfare. His family life had been relatively private. He'd married Marie Godelet in 1862, and they'd had 5 children. Marie died in 1877, relatively young, leaving Eiffel to raise their children while building his engineering empire. He never remarried. His children became successful in various fields, but none followed him into engineering. The Eiffel dynasty was a single generation. The tower itself continued evolving. In the 1920s, electric lighting replaced the original gas lights, making it even more spectacular at night. Radio broadcasting expanded, with the tower becoming the transmission point for early radio programs. Scientists installed various experimental equipment, studying everything from cosmic rays to atmospheric chemistry. The artistic opposition had completely collapsed by this point. Young artists and architects in the 1920s looked at the tower as inspiration, not abomination. The Art Deco movement embraced geometric patterns similar to the tower's lattice structure. Modernist architects argued that Eiffel had been ahead of his time, that his willingness to let structure become aesthetic was revolutionary. Even more ironically, the tower became a symbol of Paris itself, the image that represented the city worldwide. When people thought of Paris, they thought of the Eiffel Tower, not Notre Dame Cathedral, not the Louvre, not the Arc de Triomphe. The useless and monstrous Iron Tower had become the defining icon of French culture, the thing that 300 artists had sworn would destroy Paris's beauty forever. Eiffel died on December 27, 1923, in his Paris mansion. He was 91 years old. According to accounts, he'd been working on aeronautical calculations just days before his death. He died of natural causes, his mind apparently still sharp. The funeral was a major event. Government officials attended. Engineering societies sent representatives. Aviation pioneers paid respects. The newspapers that had once gleefully covered his Panama scandal trial now wrote respectful obituaries celebrating his engineering achievements. But the full truth of his reputation remained complicated, a mixture of brilliant innovator and controversial businessman. Here's what's fascinating about Eiffel's death. By 1923, the tower had been standing for 34 years. An entire generation had grown up with it as a familiar part of the Paris skyline. Young people couldn't imagine Paris without the tower. The idea that anyone had ever opposed it seemed absurd to them. The tower's survival was no longer in question. It had proven its value too many times. As a tourist attraction generating revenue, as a radio antenna providing communications, as a scientific laboratory advancing knowledge, as a military asset protecting national security. Every practical argument for destroying it had been systematically demolished by events. And here's the ultimate irony. The Panama Canal, the project that nearly destroyed Eiffel's reputation, finally opened in 1914, 25 years after his trial. The Americans completed it after taking over from the failed French effort. The lock gates, the mechanism at the heart of Eiffel's scandal, worked perfectly. His engineering designs were sound. The costs he'd charged, which seemed inflated in 1893, looked more reasonable when you understood the actual technical challenges. He'd been right about the engineering, even if the business dealings around it remained murky. The story could end here, with Eiffel dying peacefully after witnessing his tower's transformation from controversial innovation to beloved landmark. But that would miss something crucial about what his tower meant and what his legacy actually represented. Because the tower's story didn't end with Eiffel's death. In many ways, it was just beginning. Let's talk about what Gustave Eiffel actually accomplished, because it's more complicated and interesting than just building a tall tower. First, he revolutionized how large structures get built. The prefabrication techniques he pioneered, manufacturing components in a controlled factory environment, and then assembling them on site, became standard practice for 20th century construction. When you see modern buildings being assembled from factory-made sections, you're seeing Eiffel's methodology. The precision manufacturing he insisted on, where every piece had to fit within 1 millimeter of specifications, forced improvements in industrial production. Factories had to develop better measurement tools, more consistent manufacturing processes, stricter quality control. This raised the standard for all metal fabrication, not just for bridges and towers. His work on wind resistance calculations laid foundations for aeronautical engineering. Before Eiffel's systematic measurements, engineers basically guessed at wind loads. They'd estimate based on intuition and rough calculations, which worked okay for short buildings but became dangerous for tall structures or aircraft. Eiffel's data gave engineers real numbers backed by experimental evidence. The tower itself demonstrated that iron could be beautiful, that industrial materials could create aesthetic experiences. This sounds obvious now because we're used to modern architecture that celebrates steel and glass, an exposed structure. But in 1889, this was revolutionary. Eiffel forced people to see engineering as a form of art, whether they wanted to or not. But here's what we often forget. Eiffel didn't design the tower alone. Maurice Koechlin and Émile Nouguier did the mathematical work that made the structure possible. Stephen Sauvestre added the architectural refinements that made it acceptable. 200 iron workers risked their lives during construction. Eiffel gets remembered because his name is on it, but the tower was a collaborative achievement. This raises uncomfortable questions about credit and recognition. Koechlin was a brilliant engineer whose mathematical calculations were essential to the tower's structural integrity. But history remembers Eiffel, not Koechlin. Why? Because Eiffel owned the company, controlled the patents, and had the political connections to win the contract. His employees did extraordinary work and received ordinary compensation while Eiffel became famous and wealthy. Was this unfair? By modern standards? Absolutely. By 19th century standards, it was normal business practice. Company owners took credit for their employees' innovations. Engineers working for corporations didn't get individual recognition. The system was designed to concentrate glory and profit at the top. The Panama Scandal reveals another uncomfortable truth. Major industrial projects often involved financial shenanigans that benefited insiders while ordinary investors bore the risks. Was Eiffel actively corrupt, or was he just operating within a corrupt system? The appeals court's decision to overturn his conviction suggests the latter, but we'll never know for certain. The documentary evidence is incomplete, and everyone involved had reasons to lie. What we can say is that Eiffel was brilliant at engineering, ambitious to the point of obsession, excellent at self-promotion, and ethically ambiguous in his business dealings, which honestly describes most successful industrialists of his era. The difference is that most of them didn't build something so iconic that we're still talking about it over a century later. The tower's evolution after Eiffel's death is its own remarkable story. In World War II, when Germany occupied Paris, Hitler supposedly ordered the tower's destruction. The order wasn't executed, though the resistance cut elevator cables, so the Nazis couldn't easily reach the top. When Allied forces liberated Paris in 1944, the tricolor French flag flying from the tower's summit became a symbol of freedom restored. Throughout the 20th century, the tower continued adapting to new technologies. Television antennas were added for broadcasting, lighting systems were upgraded multiple times, creating ever more spectacular nighttime displays. In 1986, the tower received a comprehensive restoration for its centennial, involving stripping 20 tons of old paint and applying new protective coatings. Today, the tower receives nearly 7 million visitors annually, making it the most visited paid monument in the world. Those ticket revenues that Eiffel fought for, that critics claimed would never materialize, have generated billions of dollars over the decades. The tower isn't just a monument, it's an incredibly successful business. But here's a question worth considering. Did we lose something when industrial engineering defeated artistic tradition? The artists who opposed the tower weren't wrong to worry about industrialization's cultural impact. Throughout the 20th century, cities worldwide filled with buildings designed primarily for function, with little regard for beauty or human scale. Modernist architecture often prioritized efficiency over aesthetics, creating urban environments that were technically impressive but emotionally cold. Eiffel's tower worked because it balanced engineering and beauty. The structure is functional, but it's also elegant. The lattice pattern creates visual interest. The curve is mathematically necessary but aesthetically pleasing. Later industrial architecture often forgot this balance, giving us purely functional buildings that looked exactly like what the tower's critics feared: monstrous and soulless. There's also the question of what Eiffel might have built if the Panama scandal hadn't destroyed his engineering career. He was 60 years old when convicted, still physically capable and intellectually sharp. He might have had another 2 decades of bridge building, potentially creating structures even more ambitious than the tower. We lost that potential because of a financial scandal connected to a completely different project. And that leads us to a final mystery. What did Eiffel himself think about his tower in his final years? Did Eiffel understand what he'd created? Did he realize the tower would become the most recognizable structure in human history? The historical record gives us hints, but no definitive answer. In his memoirs, written in his 80s, Eiffel described the tower in primarily technical terms. He discussed the engineering challenges, the construction innovations, the wind resistance calculations. He mentioned the controversy, but treated it as a minor obstacle that was successfully overcome. He seemed more interested in documenting the how than reflecting on the why or the what it all meant. This was characteristic of his personality. Eiffel was, fundamentally, an engineer who thought in terms of problems and solutions. Human reactions, cultural movements, artistic debates. These weren't his natural language. He understood materials, forces, calculations, construction sequences. The emotional and symbolic dimensions of his work seemed to matter less to him than whether the rivets were properly installed. But there are glimpses of something deeper. In one letter written late in life, he mentioned watching the sunrise from the tower's top platform, describing the way light transformed the iron lattice into a structure of shadow and illumination, more complex than any architect could consciously design. This wasn't the language of a pure technician. It suggested someone who'd learned to see beauty in what he'd built. The fact that he spent his final decades doing scientific research rather than pursuing more engineering contracts might indicate a man exhausted by controversy. Building the tower had nearly broken him, physically and emotionally. The Panama scandal had finished the job. Perhaps he'd simply had enough of large-scale projects with their political complications and financial risks. Science offered purity. Experiments produced results that were true or false, not subject to the messy judgments of culture and politics. Or maybe he just wanted to prove something. That he wasn't just a businessman who profited from others' innovations, but a genuine contributor to human knowledge. His aeronautical research wasn't commercially motivated. He wasn't trying to make money or win contracts. He was advancing understanding for its own sake, leaving a legacy beyond the tower. There's a photograph of Eiffel from 1920, 3 years before his death. He's 90 years old, standing beside a wind tunnel, surrounded by scientific instruments. His beard is completely white, his posture slightly stooped, but his expression is focused, engaged. He looks like someone still discovering things, still learning. Not a man coasting on past glory, but someone actively working. That photograph captures something important about ambition and aging. Eiffel could have retired wealthy after the tower's success, living comfortably on his earnings. Instead, he kept working, kept experimenting, kept trying to understand how air resistance worked and how human flight could be improved. This suggests a person for whom achievement mattered more than comfort, for whom intellectual engagement was more important than leisure. The tower, in a sense, was both his greatest triumph and his greatest curse. It overshadowed everything else he'd built. All those bridges, all those innovative construction techniques, all that engineering expertise became footnotes to the tower. He became Eiffel the tower builder, rather than Eiffel the bridge engineer, or Eiffel the aeronautics researcher. The tower consumed his identity. And yet, what an identity to have. How many people create something that becomes an eternal symbol? The tower has been photographed billions of times, painted by countless artists, referenced in thousands of films, visited by hundreds of millions of people. It's become humanity's shorthand for Paris, for France, for human ambition successfully realized. That's an extraordinary legacy, even if it came with costs. Let's think about the lessons here, because Eiffel's story offers several that remain relevant. First, innovation almost always faces fierce opposition from people invested in existing systems. The artists who attacked the tower weren't wrong to value Paris's traditional beauty. They were wrong to assume that new forms of beauty couldn't emerge from new technologies. Progress requires disrupting comfort, and disruption is always uncomfortable. Second, public opinion can shift dramatically. What seems permanent, whether opposition or support, can reverse completely given time and changing context. The tower went from monstrous aberration to national treasure in less than 2 decades. Never assume current consensus represents permanent truth. Third, technical ability and ethical behavior are separate things. Eiffel was undeniably brilliant at engineering. He may also have been involved in corrupt business practices. Humans are complicated. We can admire someone's achievements while acknowledging their flaws. Hagiography serves nobody. Fourth, collaborative work often gets attributed to individuals. The tower exists because of hundreds of people's expertise and labor. History remembers one name, because that's how humans process information. We prefer heroes to committees, but understanding reality requires acknowledging the actual complexity of how great things get built. And finally, sometimes redemption comes from unexpected directions. The Panama scandal could have been Eiffel's final chapter, remembered as a corrupt businessman whose trial exposed industrial-era corruption. Instead, the tower he'd built earlier saved his reputation, and his subsequent scientific work provided additional redemption. Legacy isn't fixed at death. It evolves as new generations reinterpret what someone accomplished. So here's the final question. Was Gustave Eiffel a genius, a fraud, or just an ambitious engineer who got lucky and unlucky in equal measure? The answer, unsatisfyingly, is probably all three. He was brilliant at solving engineering problems. He was involved in ethically questionable business practices. He created something genuinely beautiful that enriched human culture. He profited enormously, while others did much of the actual work. He faced consequences for financial misconduct. He contributed legitimately to scientific knowledge. Real people contain contradictions. Eiffel was neither the heroic genius his admirers portrayed, nor the corrupt profiteer his critics claimed. He was a talented engineer with huge ambitions, operating in a system that rewarded certain behaviors and punished others, who happened to build something that transcended his intentions and became meaningful in ways he couldn't have predicted. The tower stands as proof that sometimes, despite human flaws and cultural resistance and financial scandals and artistic opposition, someone creates something that matters. Not because it's perfect, but because it's bold. not because everyone loves it immediately, but because it refuses to be ignored. Not because it solves every problem, but because it makes people see possibilities they hadn't imagined. Gustave Eiffel died 91 years after his birth. 91 years of engineering, controversy, innovation, scandal, and ultimately, transformation. His tower continues standing more than 130 years after its completion, visited, photographed, loved, and occasionally still criticized by people who think it's too industrial, too inelegant, too something.